It is interesting how few people seem to be sort of sincerely reflective on the past. I made a video not too long ago sort of talking about the presidents of the last 30 years. And at one point, I just sort of like reflected on how weird it is that so much of what defined the George W. Bush era is just kind of out of sight and out of mind. And like people aren't asked to sort of reflect on it.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. As you can probably tell by the fact that I am introducing this rather than Rory, we have a special guest today. We are lucky enough to be joined by JJ McCullough, a well-known figure on YouTube, has had a career, I think, in sort of broadcast opinion journalism in Canada, was a columnist for the Washington Post, and we are super psyched to have him here today. How's it going, JJ?
It's going great. Thanks for having me.
One of my favorite things about JJ's channel, or an affinity that I think we have, is that I think we both have, had a younger period in politics where we were very firm adherents of sort of more partisan ideologies, and we both sort of fallen away from that a little bit. And I think that makes your content a lot more interesting to consume for me, because I think we sort of got that in common. Like it's. Do you have like a point at which you feel like your ideology started morphing, or like do you?
Well, sort of like the background, I guess, would be, so I was born in 1984. I went to college in sort of the early 2000s. I was already sort of like starting to self-identify as a sort of dispositional conservative in the sort of my senior year of high school. I was starting to sort of feel instinctively in the kind of contrarian way that I think a lot of sort of young men of our generation often start to, sort of starting to associate authority figures with a certain kind of liberalism and liberal orthodoxy. Particularly growing up in Canada, I sort of felt that sort of acutely. And then when 9/11 happened, that sort of reinforced a certain kind of right-wing drift perhaps I was on at the time. Also, I was always very pro-America as well, which in Canada is a very sort of like right-coded kind of opinion to have. I did not grow up in an anti-American household the way I think a lot of Canadians do. So in that sort of sense, I was always kind of disposed to go in that direction. And then, of course, when 9/11 happens and there's sort of, the big sort of rah-rah American leadership and that kind of thing, I was very sort of seduced by that and very enthusiastic supporter of the Iraq War and George W. Bush throughout college. And, I sort of had a sort of desire to be a sort of conservative opinion journalist at that point. And that's basically what I then did post-college. I wrote sort of columns. I went on television in Canada. I was a sort of media talking head. I was a conservative political pundit. I worked for a conservative television station called not Fox News, called Sun News, which was sometimes characterized as being Fox News North in a Canadian context. And I was pretty happy to be a sort of partisan kind of guy in that sort of way.
Does that have something to do with Conrad Black? Is that a name?
No,
it's a different.
There's the National Post, which is Canada's sort of leading kind of like respectable right of center newspaper. Canada is actually, Canada's like America in so many ways, but sort of the National Post is kind of the Wall Street Journal to the New York Sun, and then because the New York Sun in Canada would be the Toronto Sun, which is the kind of more tabloidy, kind of sensationalistic right-wing publication.
Right.
Yeah. So, but, and then actually the station that I worked for, Sun News, as the name suggests, was sort of part of that same kind of more sensationalistic media empire.
Nice.
But anyway, I think that sort of the turning point for me, as I think for a lot of people on sort of the center right, or at least not a lot, but a certain minority faction, was definitely like the Trump thing, rise of Trump. And, sort of made me really sort of second guess the company that I was keeping and, just the inherent ugliness and I think reactionary element that existed in sort of right-wing politics that was not the kind of more high-minded sort of George Will, National Review kind of politics.
Sure. Yeah.
And of course, much like you, the sort of disillusionment that sort of followed the failure of the war on terror to deliver the kind of sort of utopian promises that we were sold and that I enthusiastically believed and defended very vigorously, whether that was on campus or in print or on television or whatever else. Like it's hard to not go through that experience and feel like you were played a little bit and feel like a bit of a sucker and And so, yeah, I mean, like, I haven't gone sort of full born again. I still think of myself as somebody that's dispositionally quite conservative, but I think that I have become much more allergic to just dogma and doctrine and orthodoxy and certainly following leaders and giving politicians blind trust and all the rest of that.
I think that's the right place to be in one's 40s, frankly. Like it's just because we've seen it. Like I was perhaps lucky that I did not have an outlet as wide as you did when I was, emphatically a sort of war on terror Bushite. But I definitely had that. I was a big supporter of the Iraq War. I bought the whole kit and caboodle. I was even being someone who never really had a strong religious association. I was finding myself making excuses for the whole package of sort of like the conservative approach. But like just at this age, even if we hadn't had that extraordinary, cycle of disillusionment from the failure of various Bush policies getting into the horror of the Donald Trump eras, it's just that like so much of, do you have this feeling that like so much of what I watch in politics is just, I've seen it all before, and I've seen it, it is so frustrating to constantly come up against like the same rhetoric that has been, some of it's been recycled from the 1930s, but just the same accusations from both sides, the same like just really boilerplate stuff that doesn't really seem like a way forward. Do you have that feeling? Or
oh yeah, and I mean it's particularly as you get older, it gets frustrating to sort of see young people seduced by discredited ideas, warmed over ideologies from the past, and see young people so excited about these ideas and feel like they found something new and special and that they're going to be, the leaders of tomorrow and all of that. And the other day I was reading some just random Substack from some like 21-year-old kid who's like an intern at some right-wing think tank or something. And in just sort of seeing like, the absurdly like overconfident way that he's like spouting about civilizational decay and like all these kind of like high-minded concepts about the left and da-da-da. And it just reminded me of myself when I was that age. And it's just frustrating to kind of think that, we're sort of doomed to just kind of go through the same cycles, and people are doomed to sort of relearn the same lessons. And everybody, I suppose that's kind of the frustrating thing when you get older, is that you become sort of at peace with your own sort of maturation sort of process, and you get annoyed that like younger people aren't there already. And you just wish you could just sort of shake them and you're not going to believe this in 30 years, you dummy. Like, why can't you just be smarter, faster? But,
I think on one hand, it makes me wish that more people stuck around, that more people kept trying to engage with this stuff. And because I think what happens to a lot of people, because I know for certain that we are not the only disillusioned movement conservatives, in our 40s right now, is that a lot of people, or certainly disillusioned leftists or what have you, this is free of party or partisanship, is a lot of people just sort of shuffle off and do something else.
That's true.
They sort of like learn the lessons and are like, well, this is all kind of silly, and nobody's actually saying anything new here. And they just sort of move on to something else. And I think that's kind of a tragedy because, not to toot our own horns, I think it's the people who've actually had the experience and sort of can cut through a lot of the nonsense are the people who should actually be discussing these things more and, potentially even making some of the decisions.
It is interesting how, I don't know, like how few people seem to be sort of sincerely reflective on the past, right? Like that's something that I find, like I made a video not too long ago sort of talking about the presidents of the last 30 years. And at one point I just sort of like reflected on how weird it is that so much of what defined the George W. Bush era is just kind of out of sight and out of mind. And like people aren't asked to sort of reflect on it. In the same way that I remember when I was younger, actually it being interesting to me that people were not asked to reflect on the Vietnam War more often, right? Like I actually remember once seeing an interview with George W. Bush where this was when he was president, and the interviewer, or I think this was when he was running for president, and the interviewer asked him, like, what do you think about the Vietnam War? Like, what was your position on that? And Bush was kind of like taken aback, like that he'd never been asked to sort of like have an opinion on something that you would expect a president to have informed his worldview from, some lessons from, right? And so I feel the same way. Like when I see like Republican politicians, everybody's on Trump's team now and everybody's saying, oh yeah, war bad. And, Trump is a great peace man and all this kind of thing. It's like, well, what do you actually? I know this is preposterous lie, but
no.
it's but on the same time, it's like I kind of like want to see some of these people like called out on it. So I was like, you believed very strongly in the Iraq War, like what do you think about that? Like, what is the lesson that you've derived from that? Like, or is it just like a switch you flick in your brain and it's like new thing now, and we'll adjust our rhetoric that way and never go back, never look back, never reflect, just try to be popular in the moment, right?
And I think that's part of that's part of the same dynamic that I'm talking about, which is that people are very committed, they're passionate, they're into it, they get disillusioned and they leave, and like the people who remember aren't part of the people who define the conversation. It's outrageous, especially so. I think I'm about 5 years older than you are, and just remembering how omnipresent Vietnam was in my youth in the 80s, like from film to television, it was just everywhere. And then somehow, an eye blink later, we were in the Iraq War era and had forgotten all of it. And it's incredibly frustrating.
I mean, I guess it's just like, there's always like, I guess there's one sort of thing that you can, I don't know, like a sort of like a myth arises to provide a pretext to stop thinking about the thing that might be intellectually sort of complicated or challenging, right? So I think that like in the case of the Iraq War, we've just kind of all collectively decided that George W. Bush was terrible, and that's, we move on from that. Like the Bush family, the Bushes, blah, 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 like they were bad. It was all sort of a product of their badness, and so we can sort of think beyond that. And I don't quite know what the myth was that sort of cleared people's consciousness about the Vietnam War. I mean, I think some of it had to do with like the POW kind of thing with the flag and all of that, like the idea that like the war was noble, but was, I don't know, what would be your sort of take?
The atrocious thing is that because it was so omnipresent in the late 80s, Platoon, Tour of Duty, all that, it couldn't be avoided in the context of the first Gulf War. So in 1990, it was actually talking about how George H.W. Bush beat Vietnam syndrome. That was an actual talking point, which is also kind of ridiculous because in the 1980s, we were actively involved in some pretty horrific conflicts in Central America. But there was this broader sense that I guess because U.S. soldiers weren't involved in that, it didn't count, which is something we're seeing more of today. So George H.W. Bush had cured us of the Vietnam syndrome, and I think people were allowed to run with that to a degree that they certainly should not have been. Is my sense. I loved those president videos that you did in two sets, right? It was sort of and you came up with a sort of interesting periodization, which is different from the way that I usually think about presidents. But it was like the greater 30 and the lesser 30, which is fascinating. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I've been, it's actually very interesting. Like I've been sort of on an intellectual journey as far as this goes. And it started when I went to Japan a few months ago. I'd lived in Japan 15 years ago, and this year I went back to sort of relive a little bit of it. And something I noticed in Japan this time was how obsessed the Japanese are with what they call sort of the Showah Era, which is sort of like their kind of conception of like, well, when were things great in Japan? And it was sort of in the Showah years, which is sort of, technically that means the sort of the reign of their late Emperor Hirohito. So like from 1945 to his death in 1989, they kind of called the Showah Era. And there's all this like Showah nostalgia, like stores advertise like Showah fashions, Showah furniture, enjoy Showah candies like you had when you were young. Like, I mean, it's something you said about the sort of the infantilization of sort of Japanese culture these days, people wanting to ever sort of live in the past. But anyway, what fascinated me about that concept was that we have, I think, a similar concept on this continent. We don't call it Showah, but we do tend to sort of sentimentalize a certain period in the aftermath of World War II, and then sort of when it ends exactly can be a little bit, hazy.
Sort of mid-century modern, I guess.
Sort of. Although it's not, because like mid-century, I think people tend to think like the 50s and like early 60s, and then we don't, like the French call it like the Magnificent 30, which is like 1945 to like
19... Glorious.
Like to like the 1930 or 1970s is I think when they end. But anyway, at some point it occurred to me that if we were to come up with an American sort of theory of this, like why not just frame it in terms of the reign of basically the World War II veteran presidents, right? So it's like you could start it from Eisenhower, or in my case, I started it with Jack Kennedy. So like 1961 up until the departure of the old man Bush in 1993. I think that is kind of, in some ways, like the great 30 era of certainly American sort of cultural flourishing in the aftermath of the Second World War. And then now we are actually coming to the conclusion of an era that I've deemed the lesser 30, which is basically the reign of the boomer presidents, which is from Clinton to now Biden. And so actually Biden's decision to step down is very convenient for me because it makes my little theory work that much more cleanly.
Yeah, I like that. Just the concept of greatest generation just sort of occupying the presidency for as long as it did was something that I'd missed completely. Because that's one of the things that's most infuriating about, and I think you put it in your video, isn't it like George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump were all born within like 6 months of each other?
Yeah, within weeks of each other, yeah.
Yeah, and then you so you essentially from 1992 to, and of course Biden is actually older than all these guys by a couple of years, but to have a single generation be that dominant for 30 years, and then actually looking back, and it was actually just the same thing beforehand. It was the whole greatest generation guys, which was kind of fascinating, just how that worked. And another thing that it makes me think of is I often, when people are like, how is history going to remember this? How is history going to remember this era? And I'm just like, they're just not. Like, it's not really, there's no big war. There's no big, I mean, there's certainly signposts that are going to be significant. Like people will remember 9/11. People will remember Barack Obama exclusively because of his biography. And honestly, I think Donald Trump might stand test of time a little bit.
Yeah.
Just because of how ridiculous the story is. Like, just like we actually elected like P.T. Barnum as president. But generally, I think most of these presidents are going to be like I pride myself on being able to like rattle off all of the presidents. And I can never make it through like the 1870s and the 1880s. I'm like, oh man, like Cleveland twice, and I just never quite manage it. And I kind of feel like this is going to be one of those eras. Like it's just a broader, like nothing mattered, despite like the very real consequences and very real horrors that the United States has occasionally unleashed in its hegemonic moment. Like, none of this is going to stick in the historical imagination, which is kind of interesting. It's like we're really good. We're like I don't know if that's overly pessimistic, but it's like we're living in one of history's forgotten eras. Do you ever get that? You ever get that feeling? Like,
oh, absolutely. I'm glad you made that analogy actually, because I've been thinking of making a video that is about sort of like the kind of the late Victorian era presidents. This sort of succession of like large bearded men who really accomplished nothing. And I remember like the Washington Post where I used to work, did an interesting podcast in sort of the lead up to the 2016 election, where they did an episode on every president in succession from Washington to, whoever the new president would be, Hillary or Trump, as they saw at the time. And what was very striking in listening to all those episodes was that, a lot of those kind of like late 19th century presidents, like they are forgotten. Like they don't have historians. Like nobody's bothered to write biographies of them. Like they don't have like great sort of scholarship around them. Like they're considered sort of forgettable and kind of pointless and irrelevant. And I think there are sort of strong analogies between that era and the sort of the lesser 30 era that we've just concluded. I in that video, I talked about the David Sayers new book, New Cold Wars, which, you can take or leave some of the conclusions in it. But I do think that like one of the big conclusions that he makes in that book, sort of analyzing the lesser 30 presidents from the perspective of foreign policy is that, like it was an era defined by just like not getting the sort of the trends that were clearly defining the world in the aftermath of the Cold War. Like there was just mismanagement of the relationship with Russia, mismanagement of the relationship with China, obviously like a dumb pivot towards the Middle East that didn't yield any sort of positive outcomes for anybody. And so in that sense, like you just kind of have a sense that like a lot of stuff was quote unquote done, but it all sort of canceled itself out in terms of its irrelevance. And it's not going to be an era that we can look back at and sort of say, well, this is when like important things were set in motion or significant sort of reforms were made or anything like that. It was just seems like, and I mean, you have to sort of, we don't want to get too sort of essentialist about it, but it's like, it's easy to to interpret that as being a kind of an extension of sort of the self-indulgence of the boomer generation, right? And just
the wasted years. Is
the wasted
way that I
years.
think about it in a lot of ways.
An abundance of confidence in sort of the service of nothing. Yeah.
Exactly. I think it was in reference to the Sanger book, was sort of talking about how what you characterized as like the Great 30s, sort of the late Cold War presidents, in contrast to the Lesser 30, is that they were criticized, the sort of Great 30, as being more focused on foreign policy than they were on domestic policy. I think you'd mentioned in your video. And I thought to myself, it's like, wow. And it's just sort of like the characterization of the Lesser 30s that they're really not interested in foreign policy and they keep getting dragged into it by various events. But they're not really that focused on domestic policy. I mean, in sort of like the Reaganite era, like it's kind of the main ethos, to the extent we have one, is sort of the market should handle it or what have you. So it's just sort of like, at least the greater 30 folks were focused on something. And I think as a group, you can say that they successfully got us through the Cold War era without annihilating humanity, which is pretty awesome. And but from Clinton through Biden, it's just like, what did we do? You know?
Well, what was the guiding vision, right? Like, and that's the sort of thing. Like, it doesn't seem like there was one. I don't know, because it's like I find myself having more and more respect for the sort of the post-war leadership class, the greater 30 presidents, just because, you know, obviously they made a lot of mistakes, and like Vietnam, for instance, a horrible, tragic, monstrous mistake, right? But at the same time, like, I think that even people like Richard Nixon, you have to say that they had a conscious idea that the most important thing for U.S. foreign policy to do was avoid another world war and attempt to establish some sort of peace among the superpowers, you know? Even Henry Kissinger, for all of his many crimes and all the rest of it, like, you can say that there was a theory of sort of peace among the major powers, and that this would sort of prevent another horrible world war, another nuclear war. Like, that was a very conscious animating principle. That's why Nixon, you know, on his grave, it says, like, there is no better title history can bestow than that of peacemaker, right? Like, there's something noble about that, right? And again, like, imperfectly implemented, no doubt. But it's like, in contrast to that, like, what was the actual sort of guiding mission of the foreign policy of sort of the lesser 30 presidents?
I know you're nowhere near this cynical, but I would say that to the extent there was a guided unifying principle post-Cold War, it was when they paid attention to it, the United States going out and trying to find an enemy. And if we needed to start wars for that, we'd do that. And I don't even really put that on the presidents. I put that on the people that the presidents, the people that were in practice and autopilot that, you know, the presidents delegated foreign authority to. Because I think there's a guy, Peter Zehan, who I'm not the biggest fan of, but I think he really does make an accurate point that since H.W. Bush, every elected president, even the second Bush, was initially elected running away from foreign policy. Like, we need to do less. This needs to be less of a factor. I don't want to deal with it. That neglect, I assume Sanger's argument, I haven't read the book, is that neglect allowed Russia and China to sort of steal a march on us somehow. But I would actually say that, like, that neglect allowed elements within the U.S. military-industrial complex to sort of pull the wool over everybody's eyes and create a lot of unnecessary conflict. But
what is, see, like, I am perhaps less cynical than you in some ways, in the sense that I'm definitely sort of less partial to the military-industrial complex sort of theory. Like, how in your understanding, like, how does that play out? Like, are you sort of a believer in the idea that it is like the weapons companies and the Lockheed Martin and this sort of thing that through lobbying and that sort of thing that they have like a material interest in there being more conflict in order to sort of sell more weapons and that sort of thing?
Absolutely. And they have a lot of great material to work with. It is a sinister thing, but it's not like a conspiratorial thing. It is that every politician has an investment in looking tough. They want to look tough. They want to look strong. It's always easy to run against an enemy. So it's not like exclusively like the sinister agenda of Lockheed Martin made everything happen. It's just that they were, especially because of that neglect on the part of the executive branch, it's just, we'd rather just not talk about this. Yeah, I mean, there's a great book, actually, I think by David Halberstam, the best and the brightest guy, about the Clinton era foreign policy. And it's kind of fascinating because probably one of the most consequential things that happened, but from our perspective, one of the most consequential things that happened during the Clinton administration was the expansion of NATO. And in this entire book that is about not Bill Clinton's presidency, but Bill Clinton's foreign policy, the expansion of NATO merits about 2 or 3 pages. It just was not on their radar at all. And so it's not like, Lockheed Martin is so powerful, but Lockheed Martin, and this is very historically documented, Lockheed Martin, in the face of what Henry Kissinger wanted, in the face of what George Kennan, the guy who came up with the policy that beat the Soviet Union, wanted, in the face of like all of these Cold Warriors who were like, absolutely don't do this, Lockheed Martin put together a lobbying campaign that got Clinton to expand NATO, not because they were so powerful, but because, they got him lunch with Lech Walesa or something, Like it was so minor and so not even a concern. It's essentially like the elected U.S. politicians took their eye off the ball, and the military-industrial complex was just like, guys, we've got to desperately survive. Because from the perspective of the military-industrial complex, the 1990s were really bleak. There's this thing called the Last Supper, which can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, which was the Clinton-era Secretary of Defense just being like, getting all the defense contractors in a room and being like, you've got to consolidate because there's no way we can pay for all of you. And it was just, I think that was, actually trying to limit the military-industrial complex was a great thing. But I think people just sort of stopped paying attention to foreign policy entirely and stopped listening to people like, Henry Kissinger and George Kennan, who were like, please don't expand NATO. That's an insane thing to do, And it's, so I definitely believe that most of our foreign policy is determined by weapons salesmen, not because weapons salesmen are incredibly powerful, but because the U.S. public and most U.S. politicians just don't care. And it's a really easy political circuit to be like, I sound tough. I cut a big check from, I got to get a big check from Lockheed Martin or Boeing. And it's just easy and unexamined. And one of my theses is just like paying a little bit more attention to this can actually correct a lot of these issues. But, I'm, after trying to do that for 10 years, I'm not so sure that that's the case.
Definitely, we remember how exhilarated a lot of people felt after 9/11, right?
Yeah.
Not because of the tragedy itself, but just because of a sense that this sort of like had given American foreign policy a sort of a fresh purpose, and that people were very sort of thrilled by this, and people did become, I don't want to sort of be too sort of flippant about it, but, like people did have a kind of like warmongery attitude, right? Like in the sense that there was something sort of thrilling that America sort of had its purpose back. I forget, somebody wrote a book and it was called like World War IV, right? Which was sort of like the idea that we've already transcended World War III, which was the Cold War, and now sort of like we're at the natural sort of like fourth part of this quadrilogy or whatever.
Was that the older Podhoretz?
I think so. I was going to say it was sort of part of one of the old sort of
the classic neocons. The like Trotskyites who became the guys who got us into Iraq. Yeah.
But it's like, but I remember feeling like seduced by this kind of thing, and I'm sure you do as well, right?
100%.
Because it did.
Yeah.
It sort of played into a kind of idea that we had. And I mean, it's interesting to sort of think of like where the origin of this kind of comes from, which kind of gets to what you were saying before, like the idea that like America's natural place in the world is to be fighting some sort of enemy, right? Like that is sort of like the natural and proper state for American foreign policy to be. So when you make a book like World War IV or whatever, it's kind of almost presenting the world wars as like, this kind of like natural sequence of events that are good and proper, like a series of movies, and that we should be awaiting sort of the next one. And obviously, and George W. Bush leaned very heavily into this in a way that I found very seductive. You draw analogies between like Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, like they are the successors to Hitler or whoever, or the communists or whoever. And it's logical to assume that there will always be somebody fulfilling that role, right? It's like the axis of evil, right? We're evoking sort of World War II era language. And this kind of stuff was so abundant at that time.
And they're trying to do it again. Like Biden actually had a speech that was so infuriating that I made like one of the darkest videos I've ever made about it, like on the channel about it, where he was just like Hamas and Putin are the same thing. And it was just like, it's just, these are completely different dynamics. The desperation to put everything into a World War II model, that just is inexplicable to me. It just makes absolutely no sense. Where I think like, and I'm trying to write a book now, which is sort of like American empire the first 100 years. And absolutely, I have not gone so far as to become some kind of deranged, horseshoe theory loony who thinks World War II was a bad thing. But the way that I think about World War II and our role in it was like, that was kind of the last resistance. Like the Germans and the Japanese were kind of like the last desperate, fanatical attempts to overturn U.S. empire. And we've just been living in a very solid and consolidating U.S. empire ever since. The Soviet Union was a big deal because they were our heavily funded weapon to destroy the Germans. And that took a while to dissipate, but it did eventually dissipate. It's incredibly frustrating to watch us go through these mental pathways that I see as largely pointless. And I'm a victim of that too. Like I spent a lot of this month being like, oh my God, like the Ukrainians have invaded Russia. Like, they could retaliate in all kinds of ways. Or, oh my God, like the Israelis have carried out this insane assassination with the guy that they were supposed to negotiate a ceasefire with in Tehran. Oh my God, what's Iran going to do? And it's like, actually, no, I'm just falling victim to this same paranoid delusion that the United States has any real enemies. Like, we just don't. And like Iran, like we've been doing this multiple times this year, where Iran in April actually had a negotiation with the United States. I mean, through Oman, where it was like, how can we retaliate against Israel in a way that makes us look like we're still something real, but doesn't hurt anybody? And it's just incredibly frustrating. But yeah, I remember that so well in the aftermath of 9/11 and in 2003 being like, yeah, like blood for blood. We've been attacked. This is, it's a terrible, tough world out there. It's not a terrible, tough world out there. It is the world the United States has made.
So one thing I would ask you, Robert, is like, what do you make of because when Trump is giving his speeches and all this, like he'll often, one of the many things he brags about is that like, oh, unless you elect me, like we're headed to World War III. World War III has never been closer. Like, what do you make of that? Like, what does that represent? Like, what does that, and and what we said before, even though Trump was not like a peace president, his supporters really want to believe that to be the case, and it's one of their favorite talking points. So what does that represent to you? Like the rise of that kind of weird rhetoric on the right, where it's like Trump is the only thing standing in the way of World War III. Trump was the peace president. Trump didn't start any wars. What does that mean?
It's incredibly frustrating to me because like the most exciting thing that any major U.S. politician has done this century was done by Donald Trump in a 2015 Republican debate. When he got up and said something that no Democratic politician had ever said, no major Democratic politician had ever said, like a major party nominee, and just get up there and said, like, Iraq was a total waste. We wasted trillions of dollars, like, for what? For nothing. And one of the things that I find so horrific about Donald Trump is that he has consistently said amazing things about foreign policy. I think his analysis of the Syrian conflict is right on. I don't think anybody other than Joe Biden could have gotten us out of Afghanistan, but I don't think anybody other than Donald Trump could have proposed getting us out of Afghanistan. I honestly think Biden and Trump deserve a joint Nobel Peace Prize for getting us out of Afghanistan, honestly. But what was so frustrating about that is that he would say these beautiful things, and then he would employ John Bolton, the father of the North Korean nuclear bomb. Or I am seduced deeply by that rhetoric, and I think it's beautiful, and I wish that the Republican Party had any serious ability to carry that out. But it's been demonstrated. Like, we had Donald Trump as president, and he made everything worse. I think that there's a lot of talk about, well, if Trump was president, maybe Ukraine wouldn't have happened. And I think there's reasons why you could make that case. But Donald Trump had the most balls-out, aggressive, anti-Russian policy I have ever seen. That any president since, really more balls-out and aggressive than any president of the Cold War, and certainly any president since. Specifically the CAATSA sanctions. People emphasize a lot the policy of arming Ukraine, which was pretty crazy, but looks better in retrospect. But we didn't just arm Ukraine, we also used our sanctioning authority under Donald Trump to attempt to destroy Russia's weapons industry. Like that's as a declaration of war against Russia, as far as I'm concerned. And that happened under Donald Trump. Donald Trump was unpredictable enough. I think there's some truth to this. That, oh yeah, they don't know what Trump's going to do, and it's like they don't know what Trump's going to do. But it's kind of like, what's the classic John Mulaney thing? Like they don't know what a horse in the elevator is going to do. There's a great bit from this American comedian John Mulaney. It's like there's a horse in the hospital. And like the Republicans are like, yeah, the adversaries don't know what Trump's going to do. And I'm like, yeah, that's true because it's a horse in the hospital. Like it's not like that comes from a lack of recognition that the entire world, including Russia and China, is immensely dependent on the United States being, somewhat sanely run. Yeah. And Donald Trump is a horse in the hospital. And by dint of, his media architecture and Republican just legacy, the only people he has to work for him are the same deranged people behind the Iraq War. And yeah, you can make a case that he'll do a better job this time around, but you're not going to convince me, or I think anybody who paid much attention to the first Trump administration from a foreign policy perspective.
Well, I mean, it's still sort of, I guess, begs the question of like, well, what is the guiding sort of larger vision here, right? And because, I mean, I don't know, because it seems like now, because you're kind of getting into this like weird sort of growth of an ideology within the right wing, that like Putin's Russia is actually like very based and trad, and like we should sort of like it for like domestic policy reasons, But I mean, it was interesting to hear what you said, because I've heard people make a sort of similar case before, that kind of the conventional wisdom on the Trump foreign policy is in some ways kind of backwards, or sort of the conventional sort of like liberal wisdom, which is to sort of say that Trump was super tight with Putin and super aggressive with China, when in really it was actually the other way around, that it was actually like quite an aggressively like anti-Russian foreign policy, and that was quite pro-China in some ways, or at least was more interested in sort of fostering sort of close connections. What do you make of the sort of that take? Do you think that because I mean, like, that's the other thing that like Trump does get a lot of flack for. And in some ways, like Trump's position on China, or at least his sort of rhetorical position on China, is in some ways like a position that doesn't have a sort of natural audience, because the right wing is, as you know, like really sort of gunning for some sort of like conflict with China. But then, sort of like the left wing is not like pro-China either. So like there's a kind of like blasé about it. So, but then Trump, at least ostensibly, is always going on about, me and Xi, we get along so well, we're best buddies, and I love him, and he's so respectable, and all that kind of thing.
I think there's been an investment since 1989. There has been an across-the-board massive investment in Washington, D.C., in the foreign policy apparatus, in the Pentagon, what have you. There's been a tremendous underlying appetite for conflict with China. Like I remember being in college in the late 90s, and I had a buddy who was doing ROTC, and he was like, just like out of nowhere, he's like, yeah, man, all they talk about is China. All we think about is like how we're going to fight China. This is in the 90s. What got in the way of that was, the people who actually run the country, which is business people. It is, the Fortune 500, whatever, like this, that, and the other thing. The fact that for a lot of presidential administrations, they're like, okay, cool, like we'll let the military do its contingency plans. We'll let the foreign policy think tanks, sit around and sort of fantasize about war with China or whatever, but we're going to make money. That's the main thing. And China was a tremendous opportunity to make money. But there was this incredible, I think Trump will probably end up being credited for the turn against China, which I think is completely unfair, because I think there was a tremendous constituency in Washington, D.C., at think tanks, in the military, contractors, this sort of thing, that was been chomping at the bit for aggression against China for a long, long time. To the point where Obama wanted to do that. Like the whole pivot to Asia was actually kind of with a few things that got implemented when we weren't dragging ourselves back into the Middle East, were actually more savvy attempts to take on China, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which had a lot of other problems related to it, but was actually like a much smarter, cleverer, less belligerent way to do what Trump claimed to be starting the process of. So I think Trump's relationship being anti-China is exaggerated, but I think you have to understand that in the context of any elected president, any business person is going to be infinitely more friendly to China than the sort of permanent government, than the sort of like, if you want to call it, I guess the Democrats call it the blob, the Republicans call it the deep state. The blob, the deep state, even through the 90s and the aughts, has been desperate to start this fight with China. And I think that Obama started throwing them breadcrumbs. And then Trump, by dint of just not being there, really, like he was not a leader. He was not like most presidents get into office and like have personnel policies, have people that they rely on through the course of their presidency. Like Donald Trump was a reality TV show, and he kind of unleashed, and this is why I find it so infuriating when he's described as the peace president. He didn't have the capacity to actually organize a war. If to start a war, you need a president that's competent enough to push a policy through. To start a war, to create the underpinnings for future wars, you just have to, that's what the blob, the permanent governor, or the deep state wants to do. And if you just take the governor off entirely, and that's what Trump did, he took the governor off entirely. He tried to start a war with Venezuela, but couldn't, he was so incompetent, he didn't have any media connections, he couldn't actually start that war that he and Elliott Abrams and John Bolton desperately wanted to start. But by taking the governor off of everything else and making everything about the Mueller trial and like his travails and the apparatus in Washington, D.C. that is constantly trying to start wars, laid the groundwork for war with Russia, laid the groundwork for war with China. I guess you could say that Trump was the peace president because he didn't have the competence to actually put a war through. And one of the greatest things about Joe Biden that is very incomplete is that he kind of just stopped a lot of Obama's drone wars. He just of course, now by the end of his presidency, we're heavily bombing Yemen for different reasons. But like just the Afghanistan, the Somalia, the across the Sahel, there was just sort of nonstop bombing that Obama started in this very carefully legalistic, like, I'm the president, I'm going to oversee each and every assassination that is done. And then you look at 2017, Trump's first year in power, the entire broader war on terror did not end, it accelerated. And just nobody was paying attention to it. Trump was like, yeah, you want to kill somebody, go do it, don't bother me with it. It went absolutely through the roof to no positive effect. And the Biden administration just sort of stopped doing a lot of that, which was, I think, a great thing about Biden. But yeah, just broadly, this idea that Donald Trump was a peace president is seems profoundly wrong to me. And also the idea that he somehow guided, he's going to be the symbol. It's already happened, I think, for historical purposes, that Donald Trump will be the symbol of the U.S. turn against China. But this is a turn that everybody was really ready for. There was a week in 2018 where there was a new national security strategy that was put out, and like clockwork, like The Economist, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, everybody at the same time came out with like cover stories like China lied to us, China ripped us off, China made a fool of Clinton. It was just, it's kind of extraordinary. Trump is seen as this incredibly rebellious figure, but like this turn against China, something that everybody in the establishment wanted to do. That's not true. Not in the business establishment. In the 90s and the aughts, a lot of the business people who were keeping our policy towards China more pacific, if you will, either A, made their money, or B, kind of failed to make their money in China and became more open to a much more aggressive turn towards China. Because they're like, oh, actually, we're not just selling all our cars anymore. We're failing to compete. So actually now we need this turn against China, which Biden has accelerated.
The observation that I would make, in one of my videos where I made a video where I was talking about sort of the growing sort of diplomatic crisis between India and Canada, and the degree to which that is sort of an extension of sort of Canadian domestic policy and domestic politics. And then I quoted a line from Henry Kissinger at the end of that video, which I've always sort of thought was like quite insightful, although it took me a while to fully grasp, where Kissinger sort of said that what the rise of Donald Trump in many ways represented was a kind of newfound sort of synergy between foreign policy and domestic policy. And what I sort of interpreted that to mean was that in some of the previous sort of conflicts, like say Vietnam or the Gulf War or whatever, like that was very much sort of, it was sold to the American public in a very sort of top-down way, which is sort of like, we are sort of the foreign policy elite, and we have sort of determined, that this conflict or whatever is in the interests of the United States as a sort of geopolitical entity, and, and it's sort of like the role of the American people to sort of be supportive of the geostrategic goals of their country, which is kind of, sometimes can be a little bit hard to sell because that requires a kind of high-minded thinking. But in the era of Trump and sort of, I think the post-Trump era as well, there's been a synergy, right? So it's like conflict with China, aggressive, sort of tense relations with China is not entirely just being sold, I think, just from the top down, because like you now have this kind of idea that some sort of like, that China is an enemy in a way that is an extension of America's sort of like perceived economic malaise, right? So it's like China is the reason why, the factory towns are out of business and this kind of thing. Like China, I've even heard people sort of, J.D. Vance makes this argument. It's sort of like China has like filled our lives with like cheap plastic garbage that's like an absence or sort of like distracts us from like the spiritual longings that we truly have in our life. And this kind of stuff, right? And it's the same with Russia, right? Like, as I said before, like the sort of the pro-Russia or sort of imagined pro-Russia sort of pivot is seen as a sort of natural extension of something that's going on in sort of the psyche of the right wing, right? Like that we shouldn't support the Ukrainians because, like Russia is like cooler and based and all of this kind of thing. And like they're a more like they represent some sort of ideal that is in sync with kind of like American sort of Republican sort of ideology, right? Like this strikes me as something that's quite new. Like the degree to which like the foreign policy decisions, at least in the way that they're sold to the public, are seen as a very direct extension of debates that are happening in American domestic politics. Like you could say that like, like maybe there was like a kind of like McCarthyite sort of like anti-communist hysteria that kind of rationalized Vietnam. But compared to what we're seeing now, I think with the way that like China and Russia are just present in American domestic cultural life in a way that I think that we have not really seen before with American geopolitical sort of rivals or anything else. What would your sort of take be?
I think maybe it's the contrast between the Russia and China thing, because I think definitely the biggest shift that we've seen in foreign policy across the time that we've been paying attention is, and I would actually point, like I really do think there was like a week in 2018 where like U.S. government and media just like consciously switched to flipped switch, going from Islamic terrorism, which is in some ways much easier to sell if you don't look into the details. Like it's much easier to sell. Look at these medieval crazy people and they did 9/11. It's got nothing to do with what we're doing over there for sure. It's an easier sell. They're coming after us. They did this to us.
Yes.
Because I actually don't see the way that China and Russia are talked about now as more ideological. I see it as more desperately, farcically ideological, because the way that we talked about the Soviet Union, and I've been reading a lot about the Soviet Union era, trying to write this book, and the Cold War, it was a carefully constructed ideological approach, but it worked, and it actually worked very well with what the Soviets were saying. The Soviets were saying we are in an ideological war with the capitalists. The capitalists in the United States were saying, yeah, they're coming for us. They want to kill us. And because of the way that the 1930s worked, you talk about McCarthyism, which was a more extreme, sort of instantiation of this, but there were actually a lot of people in American life who had connections to communist ideology. And because it was in some ways, honestly, during the Cold War, I'm beginning to feel like it was almost a freer ideological sphere in the United States, because you definitely still had, William F. Buckley wasn't wrong. There absolutely were socialists and even communists in the universities in the United States. So I think what we're seeing with that desperate attempt on the right to make affinity with Russia or antagonism against China into an ideological crusade is a desperate attempt to reconstruct something that actually was almost real during the Cold War. Like during the Cold War, a lot of this was manufactured, a lot of it was oversold, a lot of it was used to do horrible, horrible things. But it is true that both the Soviets and the United States saw themselves as in a real ideological battle. And you mentioned earlier just how the United States just naturally sees itself as fighting against someone. And the Soviets were great enemies. And it's one of the saddest things I saw was, did you watch that Tucker Carlson Putin interview?
I couldn't get through it.
I think I did a podcast on it, so I watched, the whole thing.
Oh, really?
And one
Wow.
of the saddest things was at the end is Tucker desperately trying to get Putin to play North American culture warrior. Like,
Oh, yeah.
how do you feel about God? And he was like, religion is important to people. And he was begging for like Putin to take on this mantle of like
Yes.
the Orthodox Christian savior of masculinity and conservatism and Christianity. And he was just sort of like, some people like God, I don't know. You know, he was like, Putin just had no
Yeah.
interest in this. And
Yeah.
it's that desperation for an ideological justification, because, you know, we had real ideological justifications against the Soviet Union, real ideological justification against the Japanese and the Germans. And actually, you know, the only real enemy that the United States has had during the 19th century, real justifications against the British Empire, real ideological justifications. We just don't, it's a sad desperation. I mean, Russians and both the Russians and the Chinese have spent the past lesser 30 years, if you will,
Yes.
desperately contorting themselves into a situation that's palatable to the United States, like doing everything in their power to try to cater to what we said we cared about throughout the Cold War: capitalism, free enterprise, yada yada. And obviously they've failed in very major ways, but they're just not the ideological threats that the Soviet Union was or the British Empire was, and they never will be.
But is it not the case as well, though, that that in some ways, like American domestic opinion on the Soviet Union was sort of more radical than the American sort of like leadership class was, right? Which is that even though, like, you know, that sort of like your base level American, you know, was very anti-communist and really sort of viewed the Cold War as being ideologically justified. Was it not true, though, that like people like Nixon and Carter and Reagan even were like interested in sort of trying to transcend that and be sort of peacemakers in a way that was not driven by ideology, which is that sort of like that they were willing to go and, you know, shake hands with the Soviet leaders and sort of, you know, try to like end the Cold War. I mean, yeah, obviously they were, you know, these presidents were funding all sorts of anti-communist sort of activities all over the world and all the rest of it. But there was always a kind of like sense that they could sort of like, I don't know, transcend sort of like the domestic or like sort of the domestic demand for a much harder, more dogmatic, ideological, anti-communist foreign policy than a lot of the presidents of that time were actually interested in pursuing.
Well, 100%, because that's the distinction between Nixon as president and Reagan as president, between Nixon as candidate, because both of these guys had huge political profiles in the United States for decades before they became presidents. And I think both of them, to differing degrees, were as fanatical anti-communists. I think by the time Nixon came into power, he was already willing to be more pragmatic. He'd been vice president. He'd sort of understood these issues on a more sophisticated level. But Reagan, I think the early Reagan administration, like, he was very hardcore, and it scared a lot of people. Like, you know, Gorbachev tear down this wall, I think as president, describing the Soviet Union as an evil empire. And one of the extraordinary stories of the Reagan administration is, I think Reagan going through exactly that process and realizing like, oh, actually, I don't want to end the world, and becoming much more willing to work with Gorbachev. And I think that it was more real. Like, I don't think the Cold War was as much of a competition as it was portrayed to be after the 1950s. But at no point during the Cold War were we very distant from the possibility of annihilating human civilization. It was a much more serious conflict, and like reality had a lot more weight whereas everything in U.S. foreign policy today is to some degree fantasy. I believe.
Yes, that's the term that Sanger actually uses in the Cold War book. He calls it we're in the fantasy era of American foreign policy, which I thought was pretty astute. And I think, to go back to, I think what we were sort of saying before is like, I think that there is something to be said, not to be too great man theory about all of this, but I think there is something to be said about sort of the caliber of people that have been elected to the presidency over the last couple of cycles. Like people that are just less serious in some ways. I mean, I do think like one thing that I've come to realize as I've gotten older is I do feel like I respect Ronald Reagan a lot less. Like I find like just everything that I've read about him, like on a biographical level, I just think suggests that he was like a pretty kind of like on some level just kind of dopey, simple-minded guy. I like one description I read of him that was like, he was a sentimental liberal who became a sentimental conservative. Like it was just all about sentimentality with him. But on the other hand, I do think people like Nixon and Carter and Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson and that kind of stuff, like that they're the old man Bush, like that there was a certain there was a certain seriousness to them in the sense that they were statesmen of a type who had risen up through a long sort of political process. Whereas it seems like now you do have people that have not come through that same kind of filtration system, so to speak, where it's just like people that are being elected much more on the basis of celebrity, much more on the basis of how they make people feel. And I don't know, like it strikes me as like it shouldn't be a great surprise that if you're electing much more politically inexperienced people with much thinner resumes whose greatest political successes are, their great sort of political talent is mostly due to their skill is at public speaking or their ability to sort of evoke certain emotions in the part of the electorate. It shouldn't, I guess, be that much of a shock that they run a fundamentally less sort of serious foreign policy.
The contrast between spending your teens and 20s trying to win World War II versus spending your teens and 20s like trying to get laid during the sexual revolution, it's a very different set of circumstances. Of course, the problem is that like, I guess the last serious veteran that was, I guess, Kerry and McCain were the last, serious combat veterans. And I do actually see John Kerry as sort of perhaps a throwback to an older era and a more serious generation. I think John McCain had, possibly the worst foreign policy judgment of any U.S. politician I can think of.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Where do you think that comes from? Like, because this is an interesting thing as well. Like when we talk about sort of generations and presidents and all of that, like that there never will be a Vietnam veteran as president.
No,
and that's kind of like that's interesting. And it's also interesting to think that McCain, I don't know, like because McCain seems like he's become like quite a great villain to a broad sort of swatch of people. People like his sort of disposition. But in terms of like very few people, I think, would sort of go on the record and say that like, America would be in a better place if he had his finger on the button. Right. But like, do you think that he is in any way sort of like reflective of what his generation and his generation of Vietnam veterans, sort of like the political sort of the foreign policy worldview that they absorbed? Because in some ways, like you could say that he seems like maybe even a bit of an outlier within his generation and within sort of his cohort of men that went through what he did.
Well, what's interesting is that, I think what's really interesting is that all the baby boomer presidents we've had, none of them fought in Vietnam. And that's actually not representative of the experience of the baby boom generation. I mean, my mother lost friends, and she grew up in an affluent suburb. She lost a lot of friends in Vietnam. I think that the baby boomer generation, and I think there are a lot of members of the baby boomer generation who are probably kind of resentful that Woodstock and protesting the Vietnam War has become the symbol of that generation, because there were a lot. And I guess McCain was much older than a boomer, but like probably a decade older than like technically a boomer. But there are a lot of baby boomers who went and fought in Vietnam voluntarily. They weren't all doing heroin and trying to get out. It wasn't.
I mean, here's just a random Random fun fact I can tell you, Robert, is that
Yes.
a lot of, as much as sort of Canada has this reputation as being the great sort of refuge for American draft dodgers, a lot of Canadians went the other way too. Like a lot of Canadians left Canada to enlist in the U.S. military to go and fight in Vietnam. I remember
Jesus.
when I was
Yeah.
in college, one of my best friends, his father had actually been one of those guys
Wow.
who actually
Okay.
enlisted
Yeah.
to fight in Vietnam,
Yeah.
because the cause was seen as so noble. Yeah.
And so that's sort of an interesting thing, like the sort of elite level lawyers and, what's that classic CCR song, Fortunate Son?
Oh,
that
yeah.
really could have been written about George W. Bush. Like, I think actually
Yes.
like kind of is like the George W. Bush anthem. It's like,
Yeah.
Bill Silver Spoon in his mouth. I ain't no senator's son. He was a senator's
Yeah.
grandson, actually.
Yeah.
It is very interesting that Democrats and Republicans, we definitely got the draft dodging, pot smoking folks more elite folks who ended up as the presidents, which I guess isn't that surprising. It's always the more elite folks generally who end up as presidents. But it is, I think that, not to ever speak up for the baby boom generation, but I
Yeah.
think they had a much more diverse experience than like, oh, I went to Woodstock and then I became a Gordon Gekko like stockbroker in the 80s and now I vote for the Republican. Like there are elements of this archetype are present, of course, across the generation, but it's not quite that simple and straightforward, I guess.
Recording Ruri here. Just to let you know, be sure to follow us on your favourite podcasting platform so you don't miss the thrilling conclusion of Rob and JJ's conversation next time. The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.